Well, hello everyone. Welcome. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to just give a brief opening statement, tell you who I am. My name is Corey Katz. I am the postdoctoral researcher in the ethics of sustainable development at the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State. And today's panel is on the topic of hydraulic fracturing development in Ohio, and it continues the conversation that started with the Center for Ethics 2015-2016 Compass Year on the theme of environmental sustainability. So we're keeping the environmental sustainability conversation going. Areas in Ohio are experiencing a surge in the development of unconventional sources of fossil fuels, especially the use of hydraulic fracturing technologies to gain access to natural gas that's trapped in shale rock. The Marcellus Shale Formation underlies the easternmost parts of our state, and the Utica Shale Formation underlies much of eastern and southern Ohio, as well as parts of New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Industry interest in Ohio's shale reserves have grown quickly. For example, in Ohio in 2014, 511 billion cubic feet of natural gas was produced, which was an increase of 344 billion cubic feet from the previous year. So in 1 year, production increased 344 billion cubic feet. Another stat, as of June 2017, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources has issued almost 2,600 permits for hydraulic fracturing wells. Now, I am a philosopher who studies the relationship between moral and political philosophy and environmental issues. So the topic of hydraulic fracturing is pretty far outside of my wheelhouse. So you might ask why I helped put together this panel. So one reason is that the Center for Ethics and Human Values aims to facilitate public discussion on a wide range of social issues that connect to ethical questions. We aim to foster thoughtful conversations that promote free thought, reason, understanding, and tolerance among the campus and the wider community. Another reason I put together this panel is personal. Hydraulic fracturing has become a hot button issue, but I realized that I knew very little about it beyond a documentary that I saw or a couple of newspaper articles. I figured if I was asking myself this question, what should I think about this development in Ohio, then I assumed that others probably were asking themselves that question as well. Thus, getting 5 smart, experienced people who have a wealth of experience, as well as their own perspectives on this topic together to learn, to discuss, and to have questions from the audience, and that's what we're going to do today. So I'll introduce our panelists. First we have Scott Kell,
Yes.
Who's a geologist,
Yes.
and is the assistant chief of the Ohio Division of Natural Resources, Division of Oil and Gas Resources. We have Greg Pace. Say hello. Greg is on the board of directors of the Ohio Community Rights Network. He's a member of the Guernsey County Citizen Support on Drilling Issues and involved in a number of other organizations on this issue. Via Skype, thank you very much, we have Kathy Braiser. Kathy is an associate professor of rural sociology at Penn State, but she studies the way that local communities think about and sort of address issues surrounding hydraulic fracturing, mainly in Pennsylvania, I think, but yes. I think you'll have a wealth of experience to share with us. We have Chris Penrose. Chris Penrose is an associate professor, and he's also helps run the Ohio State Extension Shale Education Program in Morgan County. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Very good. And finally, we have Rhonda Rita. Rhonda is the executive director of the Ohio Oil and Gas Energy Education Program. So we have a big panel. 5 people is quite a bit on a panel. So just as a preface, I'd ask everyone to try to keep their responses short so we have time to hear from everyone. Part of the reason why we have 5 people on the panel is because I wanted, and I was hoping to get a kind of range of perspectives on this issue from both government, industry, citizens groups, academia, and so on. So I think we're going to have a good discussion. So my first question is, how does hydraulic fracturing work? And maybe I'll go to Rhonda first.
Hydraulic fracturing is 2 minutes. This is probably normally about a 5-hour presentation, so I got 2 minutes to explain that. It's an engineering process started in the 40s. Instead of dropping dynamite or nitroglycerin down into the well bore in the 40s, we started, once the well's been drilled, you take water under very high pressure and you create very small fractures, really they're fissures. You fill those fissures in with sand. Sand is very specific. Those sand molecules then allow the oil and gas to flow between the rock formations to the surface so that we can then produce a lot of different products as well as a lot of energy. It's about, without getting into very specifics on that, I mean, that's what it is. About 1.2 million wells across the United States have been hydraulically fractured. You'll also see that very common in accessing commercial quantities of geothermal, as well as you'll see some rock formation stimulated for water wells and other purposes. So it's not exclusive to oil and gas.
So why was this new way, let's say relatively recent way, this hydraulic fracturing way, why did that have to be developed, or why does that have to be used to get at this, at these resources?
You know, in Ohio, we can drill and produce out of 30 different geological formations, okay? So we've got great geology here in Ohio. We've been drilling through the Utica and the Marcellus Shale for more than 100 years. And frankly, vertically, you just could not release enough of that rock in order to make commercial quantities of oil and gas productive. I think people confuse that word hydraulic fracturing with, they use it as a catch-all term, and I want to be real careful because it shouldn't be confused as a catch-all term, because it's a very specific engineering that is typically done once in the life of the well. Okay, so today with advancements, what we now know, what we're able to look at underneath the ground, we can look at 3D models underneath the ground. We know how thick the formations are, how far they extend out. What we can do is with, as horizontal drilling, that's really what has been advanced. As horizontal drilling has advanced, we are now able to really commercially produce just some phenomenal quantities out of the Utica and Marcellus Shale. What we now know about those formations is that those are what are referred to as a source rock, and the other formations are reservoir rock. So we are just getting phenomenal production. And actually, just to update, 1.4 trillion cubic feet of natural gas was produced. That is a state record. And just to put that into perspective just a tiny bit, 7 years ago, we produced enough natural gas to satisfy about 20% of our energy needs. Today, Ohio is producing 100% of our energy needs, and we're actually exporting it to some of our sister states.
Great. Okay, so it's horizontal drilling. So instead of drilling straight down in a kind of traditional well, you drill down and then horizontally to get at these other forms of
Correct.
Other locations.
So today, instead of drilling maybe the equivalent of 32 vertical wells on the surface, we're going to put one hole in the ground, and we can horizontally drill and produce all along that lateral. So we're actually reducing the environmental surface footprint on the top by being able to drill a single hole in the ground. It's just absolutely incredible. The first horizontal well that was ever drilled was actually in Pickaway County. Go back and look at Popular Mechanics, 1941. And unfortunately, that well was unsuccessful. So we've even horizontal drilling has come a long way since the 40s.
Great. Does anyone else have anything to contribute to helping people understand how the process works?
How much water is used when they do this?
You know, it really varies depending on the well. No two wells are the same. So it depends if it's a vertical, and remember, we still drill plenty of vertical wells. It's all about the geology. Okay, so we're going to drill vertically, we're going to have directional wells, and we are going to have horizontal wells. The amount of water, there's stages in the water, and I don't know if you're asked, can he ask me the
Well,
question?
I'm
Is that
asking
okay?
for everybody else, really,
Okay.
so.
So there are three waters, and people get very confused by the waters. The first time we need water is during the drilling process, and we need water to simply make mud. And I'm going to keep this very simply. You've got a drill bit going into the ground, into these geological formations. You want to keep that drill bit lubricated at all times. The second time we're going to use water is when we are, and actually we call it well stimulation as opposed to hydraulic fracturing, is when you're stimulating the well, and it's going to be a one-time water withdrawal. Remember, we need to put pressure on the rock to create those small fissures. And then the third water, because again, it just gets confusing, is at one time Ohio, where we're standing right now, this was completely covered by ocean. So all this is one big ocean. So what got trapped in the same geological formations is brine or salt water. So we're going to produce that salt water along with the oil and gas.
Great. So what are the benefits of increasing this form of development for both local communities and for the United States as a whole? And does someone want to jump in on that?
I can try jumping in.
Sure.
You know, I can look at it from a couple different ways. I can kind of look at it from more of a global perspective, or I can even take a different aspect and take a look at it from more of a personal perspective. I live down in Morgan County, where we're on the edge of a lot of this happening, and you know, it can, you know, doing this has the potential to benefit a lot of the families out there, and some people, you know, when they look at getting a lease for the first time, you know, there in the past has been some big money involved with that, and depending on where the people are at, you know, what stage they are financially, what type of priorities they have on their property, it's something that they may be really interested in doing, because it can help pay off some debt. It has the ability to help put their kids through college. Philanthropy is a big thing down in our part of the state for those that have had that. But also then you can also take a different stand. You know, I'm also a property owner, and I've always been very concerned. You know, if I was ever approached for a lease, would I do it or not? You know, do I want the money? Yeah. Do I need the money? You know, I work for Ohio State University. Hopefully I'm getting paid good enough that, you know, hopefully I don't need the money. But I guess my point is different people have different priorities and different needs. So when I look at it from the individual perspective, there's a lot of different things to consider with something like this.
Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. So the well has to be placed and drilled on someone's property.
That's the $64,000 question. Would I be more likely to lease my land if that pad was put on someone else's property? I mean, in all honesty, probably yes. But if it's going to be put out in my backyard, probably no. And what's really interesting is when I was talking with Mike McCormick with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, some of these laterals now are going as far as 3 miles. You know, on my farm that has almost 300 acres, that would be seven of the traditional vertical wells, 7 to 8 of the traditional vertical wells. Now with some of these, you can end up with only, in theory, 1 of them. And it's even such now that you could almost theoretically put 1 pad for a whole township if the laterals could all go out 3 miles. So like Rhonda was saying, the potential for the footprint is a lot different now than what it was. I was flying over Texas a few years ago between Austin and Dallas, and everywhere you saw nothing but wells all over the place. But I was flying to Baltimore, and then once you got over into the Marcellus over there in Pennsylvania, you could see it, but not nearly as much. I mean, actually, the footprint was a whole lot different.
So there are benefits for landowners in leasing the rights to the oil and gas under their.
There's benefits, and there's also disadvantages too. So, you know, it all depends on the people's priorities you know, and how they feel about the issues and where they're at financially. So, you know, when I'm looking at it from the individual perspective, those are some of the different things that I've seen people, you know, have to consider and try to balance out.
Now, and Corey, if I would add, though, you know, and again, I've been around the industry for 30 years. It's when we are approaching a landowner about leasing, and I worked for an E&P company at one time, it should never be about the money, just about the money. There's a lot of things that a landowner should take a look at. The other thing is, it's also important to understand, I just want to preface that, is we have to produce all energy sources. We cannot rely on any one. And so the development of any kind of energy source involves some kind of footprint and typically is going to involve some kind of landowner. But you never want it to be about just money. And I always say, you know, I'm an industry person, but the minute you start disrespecting the fact that you're on someone else's property is hopefully the day you're not in our business too.
You know, it's also interesting that, and we sometimes project what we have here in this country, where when you own property rights at surface, you often also own the mineral rights. You acquire property, and this is something, if you ever buy property, you want to check out to make sure you are acquiring the mineral rights. But a lot of surface owners in Ohio, a very high percentage, also own the mineral rights. That means that no one can come in and extract them without you granting them permission through a lease agreement. I've dealt with regulators in Europe when the Soviet Union collapsed and they began to try to create a governmental system to regulate their oil and gas industry. I've dealt with the Russian delegations, and the interesting things, in most places in the world, your surface rights don't give you any rights over the minerals. And so it's the government that decides where wells are drilled. And if they decide to drill one on your property, tough. You don't get a say in it, and you don't get the lease bonuses, you don't get the royalty payments, you don't get to negotiate where the access road or where storage facilities or any of these things can be. So we live in an interesting country where very important decisions are made as locally as they can possibly be made.
Great. So I see hands in the audience, so I didn't preface at the start. We were going to have the panelists answer questions for about 90 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes to take questions at the end. So if you want to make note of them, we'll be able to come back to all of these issues. But thank you.
I'd like to kind of, on the particular aspect of the subject that we're on now about individual ownership, property owners, and the benefits they get. And I know this fracturing is an incredible technology for what they can get out of the ground. It really is. I see one of the schisms here is where when people don't want it to happen on their property, then they start running into problems. And I've run into people down in Southeast Ohio. There's one family in particular who they held out for close to 3 years. They were one out of 86 people in an area that held out and didn't sign a lease. And they went through all kinds of problems with harassment problems from different sources. And they finally signed, and so now they signed because they didn't want to go through that anymore. And now they deal with a compressor station about a mile down. They deal with they've got 9 wells fracked on their, it was an Indian burial ground on top of a ridge on their property that they carved out to put the well pad on. Now they have 9 wells fracked, and every time they frack, they can't go outside because it smells so much. And so I want to bring that side of the story in today in terms of what this industry brings to individual families, as they're saying. And I think that this industry and the regulatory environment are very much tuned to help focus on the industry and on people who want to have oil and gas done on their property, but people who don't want it or don't want it near their property, really, that's when we run into the problems. And I call it economic democracy. And the economic democracy to me is where you have the option, you have the choice, you have your say on how your resources are are accessed, or how you have access to your resources, especially water and your land and so forth. And I find that what I'm experiencing, what I'm seeing it people experience, is that when they don't want to partake in the oil and gas process around where it's being done, that they can't stop it. They can't be a part of keeping their property and keeping their life the way they want it to. So that's part of the schism of the whole process.
Greg, would that be similar though to wind production and solar production and aggregates, coal? That would be a similar to those as well, not just oil and gas, correct?
Oh, with anything, sure,
Yeah,
with any
yeah,
type of industrial activities. With oil and gas, to me, it's in Ohio. That's the big one in Ohio right now. It came in for the last 7 years. It's big time. It's the big push. And right now, we're in kind of a lull that's starting up again. We had, 53 rigs in Ohio, I think, at the high point back around 2014. So there were 53 wells being dug at one time. Most of them these big horizontal laterals. And then we were down to like 13 a year or two ago.
About 22 now.
When the price of oil and gas dropped, of course, they slowed down. Now it's on the uprise again. Now we got 4 pipelines coming through Ohio they're building.
And we're up
exporting.
we're up to about 22 rigs now. And the interesting thing is those rigs now can do it twice as fast as they used to, and the laterals are going twice as fast as they used to.
Well, they're using more water.
So
That's
you're
another
actually having
thing.
a net
They've got
a lot more
the
production.
outlaw lateral, and they call them super laterals now. We were getting used to, 3 or 4 years ago, we were used to about 4 to 6 million gallons of water per frac job, with the segments and so forth. And I equate that to about 10 Olympic swimming pools. You got Olympic swimming pools, about 600,000 gallons of water. That's maybe 8 or 10 of them. And then we were getting used to 15 million gallons of water per frac job for the last couple of years. Now, over a 2-month period this summer, in I guess it's Belmont County, that they call it the outlaw well, they call it a super lateral. They've used 87 million gallons of fresh water in one well. That's 131 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water dumped down into this hole in the ground. And we're trying to figure out where it's coming up, where it's going to, where the waste, where the brines are going. We have no idea what's going on with this water.
Good.
And Greg, actually, let me try and put that into perspective for everybody, because when I hear those water numbers, back in 1983, could have been 84, we drilled 6,043 wells that year. Okay, that's a lot of wells in a single year. We were well over 100 drilling rigs. We drilled 620 wells last year. Our wells are getting smarter. We're having to drill fewer wells. Think about that. And back in the 80s, nobody was even talking about hydraulic fracturing, and every one of those wells were hydraulically fractured. So we've gone from 6,000 wells a year to about 600. And remember, just last year, we set a state record at 1.4 trillion. We're drilling fewer wells, smarter wells, and we're getting much more production out of those particular wells. So I think a lot of times people forget about that historical value. And so if you add up those number of wells, and then you add in the water, and then look at what we're doing today, we've actually figured out ways to reduce it. The average well, it depends on the well. If it's vertical, it could be a couple 100,000 gallons of water. If it's a horizontal lateral, it can be about 5 million gallons of water. And we've got some information on water also to put that into perspective so that you also understand water. And we're certainly not the only business or industry or home that certainly uses water as well. So need to keep that into perspective.
Great. So we haven't heard from Kathy yet. So if you'd like to maybe share what benefits Pennsylvania or the areas you study might be seeing, and then if you have anything to share about sort of wider benefits in the United States. I'm not sure if that's anything that you've looked into.
Well, I want to add to the conversation a little bit. It relates to your questions, but one dimension that I don't think has been talked about is with that bundle of property rights, you may own the surface and not own the subsurface. So the split estate is actually quite common, especially in western parts of Pennsylvania, in which case the question of voice or the question of control comes in quite strongly, because if you don't own your subsurface rights and whoever does leases them, they have the ability to come in. that they trump the surface rights. And while there is some compensation for access, there is not the same level of compensation as you would get if you had the subsurface rights. So that I just want to make sure that we also keep that in mind as one dimension of the property rights.
And Kathy, I would add on to that, that's probably one of the biggest issues is property rights and mineral issues. And I think Scott said it, and Kathy, thanks for bringing that up, because people really have to understand their property rights. Know what you buy before you buy it, especially the students.
Even if you know the property rights, you still have a problem with, there's a lot of lawsuits right now, especially against Chesapeake, one company. There's some class action lawsuits on royalties because, like you say, they sign the leases, even when they get lawyers and they get these 23-page leases and so forth, and it's stipulated, what they're gonna get in the royalties, what the fees are gonna be, and then they end up with all these other fees, and some people actually get negative royalties. And so there's lawsuits going on with that, that's sort of pending, so there's a lot of that going on.
So yeah, Kathy, did you want to continue?
Well, I was just going to add that one of the things that we're talking about here, and it is what I study the most, is where the site of extraction. So we focused a lot on wells, but the energy system is broader than that. So it's energy, it's extraction, but it's also production. Taking the gas and making it into other things, whether it's electricity or whether it's plastic products. It's also pipelines. That's a particular issue today. But the distribution of energy as being one of the core issues that we also should be thinking about, and then the consumption of energy. All of those have different sets of winners and losers at each of those locations. So I know we're focused on the extraction process, but I just want to lay that out there.
Great. So, so as far as other benefits of this production go, are there benefits for local jobs? Are there benefits for the United States as a whole to have increasing natural gas production as opposed to sort of domestic natural gas production as opposed to other forms of other ways?
One could easily make the argument that being energy independent has an awful lot of advantages to it. So looking at it from the larger perspective, I mean, there's a lot of advantage of being energy independent. When we're looking at local levels, we've seen quite a few jobs, whether it's in the drilling or whether it's in the pipeline development. There's also been some disadvantages to some of that. You look at some landowners that have had the pipelines go right through the farm. That's been some issues. And even folks that live in the northwestern part of Ohio or other parts of the state that aren't seeing any of this, they are seeing some of the issues related with pipeline development. Then we also have people in our community that have been very, very opportunistic when some of this development is going on, whether it's starting their own food truck type business or whether they're setting up for camper site developments. There's some advantages there. The increased traffic is an issue. Some of the road problems are issues. So there's pluses and minuses both ways.
And I would just add, again, obviously you guys know I'm an industry person, but again, being around this industry, all of it here in the state of Ohio for almost 30 years. 2011, our employment numbers were 14,400. Okay, we are currently at over 190,000 people employed. It's not just about the job number. So what's the challenge as an industry? We're currently working with more than 70 different colleges and universities and tech schools and trade schools. We got a couple problems is making sure our workforce is well trained. If you have a well-trained workforce out there, you minimize problems. It comes down to training. Our biggest challenge is probably in the trades. Because that's where the biggest and largest job demand is, whether it is the diesel mechanic, okay, or the welder. We need 1,000 welders in the state of Ohio right now. We do not have 1,000 welders qualified. And you know what our bigger problem is? The last time we surveyed, and it always depends on the size of your company, we had as high as 70% failing a drug test. And we make that message very strong and clear. You want to be in this industry, you're not going to be able to do drugs. We're hair testing now, okay? That is probably one of the biggest problems. But jobs, working with that many colleges and universities, one thing that Ohio is blessed with compared to our other states is we have great institutions all across the state. Obviously, we've got the Ohio State University here. We've got a number of phenomenal engineers that are coming out of here, some geologists, some geophysicists coming out of here. But we're really blessed across the state to have such quality training programs, again, from the diesel mechanic to the truck driver to the welding programs.
Air testing, does that disqualify me from employment in your industry? That's discriminatory, huh? You know,
Hey, we can get it off your arms, I guarantee
Okay.
you. Don't worry about it.
I think one benefit we all experience, my recollection, and correct me if my numbers aren't correct, but prior to the development of the Marcellus play in western Pennsylvania, natural gas prices were about, what, $7.50 per MCF? Now they're down around $2.50.
Correct.
We realize that, whether we know it or not, in our natural gas bills, if you're using natural gas as a heating source in your homes. Gasoline prices have been moderated. There are benefits to us as consumers, even if we live here in central Ohio and aren't experiencing some of the challenges that go along with it as well.
Okay, great. Kathy?
So let me just add to that. Some of the work that a colleague here has done, Tim Kelsey, has looked at some of the numbers around job impacts. And one of the things that he has found, particularly in the early stages of the development here in Pennsylvania, because it coincided with the recession, is that in some counties, the impact of the industry really buffered them from the effects of the recession. But the other thing that he found is that while there was increased employment in counties with heavy drilling, wages were increased higher than the actual employment figures. So whether there are real impacts on wages and income for households, it's more so that they're working more hours or they're getting higher wages than it is that there's a lot more jobs. It's changed somewhat over the course of the play here. In the early years, we didn't have the workforce to really work in the industry. It's taken a lot of time to develop the workforce here. Some numbers I've seen, to whether or not they're accurate, is that they've been employing about 75% local workers most recently, but that's a shift from the early years of development. It takes time to grow that workforce, and it takes dedicated resources to do that in order to have local economic impact.
I've seen some studies. I know one was done here at OSU. I can't remember what department. I read it last year, and they were comparing shale plays in the country and the effect on the jobless rate or on the job rate in those shale plays, and it's pretty nominal overall. And it's not long lasting. That's a big part of the problem. It's a boom bust type of industry. I know Carroll County now, where it all started in Ohio in 2011, my understanding is they're starting to slow down. They tend to take the sweet spots. They tend to dig the wells and the sweet spots in the plays, and then when the sweet spots kind of get petered out, they kind of go to another play, and it starts to peter out. And so you've got that problem with, we talk about jobs. They're not jobs that's going to feed the community, over an extended period of time. It's like the pipeliners. They move from community to community and so forth. It's longer than that, but the shale plays, the ones that we've seen over the last 15 years or so they're not a long-lasting phenomenon for jobs over more than 5 or 10 years or so, and they start to peter out. So.
And I would second that if you look at Pennsylvania's numbers, particularly in the northern part of the state.
And actually, I would disagree with that, because what you have to do is you have to understand our industry in order to be able to make, when you talk about the upstream, then there's midstream, and then there's downstream. So very quickly, upstream is the drilling portion and the production part. A drilling contractor, most wells are going to last 20 to 40 years. So that drilling contractor is going to come in one time, and he's going to drill the well, and he will be gone. But you have to look at the long-term jobs that are associated with that. Somebody constantly has to maintain the pipeline. Somebody constantly has to maintain the well. You've got accounting services being used. You still have land services being used. You also in the community. Then the pipelines have to be maintained. The processing, refining, think about what's going on in Ohio right now. If you look at all the processing and new refining facilities, these aren't short-term. They're not making billion-dollar investments because they're going to peter out in a couple years. What peters out are what people confuse with a boom and bust cycle. Again, I've been through 3 of these. The only thing that slows down is the drilling. If the commodity price gets so low that you can't afford to drill that well, we are selling natural gas. In the last 2 years, we've been selling it in negative numbers, okay? But you got to produce the natural gas in order to produce the crude oil. So usually when you hear this bust, that's usually when the drilling slows down. It's no different than many other commodities. But these wells, there's always people associated with the wells. And then when you get into the downstream side, you know, when is the last time you've gone into a grocery store and products haven't been delivered there, or things that they don't stop making things? This is the downside of the industry. And there's no bust going on there, just the drilling portion only. So these really are long-term jobs. And again, except for the drilling contractor, that's why those folks, men and women out there, they make a lot of money. They're gone for a long time. You get into offshore, they're gone 3 months at a time. That's why their salaries, but they're gone a lot, and they're moving from location to location. But the well itself, it's not like a pizza shop where you can close it down and pick it up and move it into another community. You can't do that, especially with thousands and thousands of pounds of steel pipe in the ground. You just simply can't pick it up and move it. Okay, so that well's going to produce for the next 20 to 40 years, and so are the jobs associated with that particular well. The drilling contractor
You're
won't
talking
be there.
the old conventional wells.
No, I'm not.
No, the
No,
new,
sir.
the horizontal wells, the typical horizontal well profile goes down 60% in the first year.
I understand that.
And in 5 or 6 years, most of them are capped.
Sir,
They're done.
Actually, that
5
is
or
not.
6
That
years.
is incorrect. That is incorrect.
That's my understanding of the
Well,
way they work.
Okay.
Can we hear some
Well-
of the other panelists too?
Sure.
Yes. We've talked about the local benefits of this production and the wider benefits of this production. Now, there's no form of resource production that doesn't have environmental risks. So what are the environmental risks? What are the health and safety risks of producing natural gas in this way? And how do regulators try to protect public health and safety and minimize those risks? Maybe I'll start with Scott then.
To start. Well, as with any large-scale industrial endeavor, there are going to be environmental and public health and safety risks. That's the job of a regulatory agency such as the one that I've worked with for 37 years, is to identify those risks and do everything we can through our regulatory structure to mitigate those risks and to protect. Basically, our mission is to allow the orderly development of oil and gas while ensuring the protection of public health, safety, and the environment. So that's what I've striven to do over decades of work. And I used to work with Mike Shelton, by the way, back here, and he was an outstanding legislative liaison. He helped us in leading us through a number of legislative amendments that we think upgraded our regulatory clout. But the environmental risks, we've already hit upon some of them. There's consumptive use of water. So there are water withdrawals. Those have to be managed properly so they don't have an impact on biota and so on in streams and ponds that are dependent upon those waters. Spill prevention is a very important aspect, both during the hydraulic fracturing process where you have not only water but chemical additives that are there. There is an importance of properly managing those chemicals to ensure that they don't escape location and enter the environment. When a hydraulic fracturing stimulation is over, there is a period where the well, they release the pressure on the staged hydraulic fracturing operation, and you begin to get what's called flowback, which is which consists of some of the water that they've injected, but also some of the brines that are native to those deep formations. And so you begin to get very saline water coming back to surface. That has to be managed so that that doesn't get into surface water bodies, soils, certainly into groundwater supplies. One of the risks that I've tackled as a national issue is the issue of stray gas. If wells are not properly constructed, they can be conduits for the invasion of aquifers with natural gas. We have really, over the last 10 years, we've done a remarkable job in terms of creating a very comprehensive regulatory structure for prevention. I've been on the side of investigating some of those. If you've ever knocked on the door of someone who's had a stray gas affecting their water well, trust me, by the end of that conversation, you'll be a big advocate of prevention. And I think, Mike, you remember our incident in 2008 up at Bainbridge. That was a lot of work. It was not hydraulic fracturing related, but still. We've got a very strong set of well construction regulations that I could go into great detail on, but to keep things short, everything from well construction to continual annular monitoring and other things that we have enacted have enabled us to, we have not seen a single stray gas event generated by shale development in the Utica Point Pleasant play, and we're proud of that. Of course, you've always got the risk of blowout. You have significant gas releases if the industry doesn't employ proper blowout equipment and methodologies. Those are amongst the risk that we all work to, in my agency, to manage through our permitting process, through our inspections, and through our enforcement process.
Great. Greg, you work with a number of groups that are concerned about the environmental risks of this.
Well, yeah, we're more concerned with the waste aspect of it, the solid and the liquid waste aspect of it. Right now, in the state of Ohio, in 2013, the State House mandated ODNR to write regulations for waste facilities. And it's my understanding that they never really got done the way they're supposed to. And so now we have more than 40 waste facilities on the east side of the state, around the state, that really, they gave them temporary authorizations. I don't exactly know where it is right now, but I understand, I've talked to Teresa Mills from the Center on Health and Environmental Justice today to kind of understand where this is, and she said basically they haven't really written them. So we've got all these waste facilities, we've got pits, these huge frack pits in eastern Ohio, like they've had all over in Pennsylvania. Some of them leaked and so forth, and we really don't have the regulations that were promised. I know back in 2011, I was in a meeting at ODNR with some of the ODNR people. Ohio Environmental Council was there. Teresa Mills was there, Center for Health and Environmental Justice. Teresa helps us a lot with data on injection well data around the state. And back then, we didn't have waste pits, open air waste pits in Ohio, where they were starting, all these horizontal wells back then. And I asked Tom Tugent, who was one of the deputy chiefs, I believe, at the time. I asked him personally, what's the, are we going to get these waste pits? Do we have these waste pits in Ohio? And he said, no, we don't. He said, the industry is voluntarily using a closed system where they take the waste, I guess they were storing it or whatever. And I said, well, if it's voluntary, what if they decide that they want to create these pits? He goes, well, when the time comes and they do it, we'll create the regulations. And this is what they have. They haven't really written them, and it's been going on for at least a couple of years now. And I know that something's gotten written, but my understanding is that they haven't done what they were mandated to do in 2013, which is to write these regulations with the proper criteria for managing these types of waste facilities. And so,
your concern is with the environmental risks that come from the waste products, the brine, the water that results from
the drill cuttings as well, because it's very nebulous about how much radioactive content's in the drill cuttings. In Columbus here, where I'm from, we've got people here today from our group. We're the Columbus Community Bill of Rights, part of the Ohio Community Rights Network. But in Columbus, we're concerned because we've got 13 injection wells. They're old legacy injection wells up in Morrow County. And most of them were, from old production wells back in the 60s and maybe the 70s, some of them the 80s, but then all of them were turned from production wells into injection wells. So instead of pulling stuff out, now they pump stuff up, down. Some of them are gravity fed, some of them are under pressure. And they're very old. We take people on tours of these wells and show them what the condition of these wells. We want people to actually see what they're using to pump this stuff down underneath our watershed in Columbus, because they're doing it. This is under our source water protection area for Columbus water that they're doing this in. They've been doing this in for a long time. It was back in the 60s. A local geologist we work with, Julie Wetherington Rice, explained to us that she was very involved with this for the last 30, 40 years. Before injection wells, they were just dumping it in holes in the fields, and so now people out there in Morrow County have to have public water piped out in rural areas because their soil's ruined, because their source water is ruined. And then they had injection wells, so we've heard stories of dumping, and we see a lot of problems with it. And so we've taken some city council members up there and show them what we have. So we're working with the city of Columbus to make sure that they understand and that they're focused on this as to what type of contamination risks we have. The other one we have here in Columbus is that there's a remediation landfill right next to Alum Creek on the south side of the city of Columbus. There used to be a drum dump. The EPA had to remediate it twice because it was actually toxins were going into the Alum Creek, which is a watershed creek for Grove City and south of here. But in 2013, the Ohio budget bill, they deregulated the radioactive content of shale drill cuttings. And all these horizontal wells, they have miles of shale that come up when they drill these wells. It's all radium and uranium laced. And so they deregulated it so they don't measure it, and they don't even track where it comes from, and they just dump it. Every licensed landfill in Ohio now can take this stuff as if it doesn't even exist. And this remediation landfill on the south side of Columbus, we're very concerned about that. And we
So
talked.
how does the Ohio Division of Oil and Gas, do they regulate the waste products from this process, or how does industry address the radioactivity of this waste product?
There's quite a bit to digest in this series of comments. One, we don't have impoundments all over the state because we haven't allowed them. What we do see is an industry that is committed to closed-loop steel tank systems for the containment of flowback and their produced waters. I believe that we have authorized one impoundment that was constructed under extremely rigid engineering controls and monitoring systems. We don't intend to permit any more. As a matter of fact, we're getting some of the materials from neighboring Pennsylvania because they've decided to close the impoundments that they've had. We agree, impoundments are not an ideal practice. Greg is right. We have not finished our rules. We have started. We've been working diligently on the development of rules to address waste management facilities for a number of years. And I work with the engineers that are moving those forward. They're going to be exceptional rules. But if you've never worked in the development of a rule, you can't appreciate how long it takes to work on them. I call rulemaking an exercise in constructive mistrust. You bring all these different parties to the table that mistrust each other. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, I always say I trust my mother, but I still cut the deck. But you bring the industry, you bring the regulators, you bring local citizens, local governments, environmental groups, and so on, and they all have a voice at the table, and you try to come up with a set of regulatory standards that makes sense, is enforceable, and accomplishes the objectives that you want. In the absence of a finalized rule, we are implementing, or we are authorizing a small number of waste management facilities to go forward under order. And we subject them by permit condition to the standards that that our agency anticipates the final rule will allow us to enforce. So it's not that they're unregulated. They are authorized. Their construction is inspected. Their operations are inspected. They still provide reports to us. But I agree totally with Greg. The ideal is to get these regulations finished, and we are working towards that. They take a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of time. And by the way, when those rules are put online, everyone in this room has an opportunity to comment on it. So your perspective can help shape those rules as well.
Great. Kathy, did you want to share any perspectives on the environmental risks and how they're being managed in local communities?
That's a little bit outside my expertise, but I just wanted to throw out, since there was a discussion about health, the Environmental Health Project, which is located primarily in the southwest part of the state, is trying to track health concerns that residents might raise, and that might be another resource to look at.
Okay, so now I'd like to come to questions about environmental justice. So when we think about environmental justice, there are sort of two questions that people often think about. One, right, as we said, any form of industrial development has environmental risks. One question might be, who do those risks fall on? Are they being shared in an equitable way, or are they mostly falling on people who are already disadvantaged? And the second question we think about is access to decision-making. Do those people who are most affected by a form of development have effective voice in the decisions that are made regarding that? So I first would like to come to that second question about access to decision-making. So from what I understand, the state of Ohio is distinctive in that standing law vests all power over permitting and regulating oil and gas drilling with the Division of Oil and Gas Resources, to the exclusion of local authorities. Moreover, in 1992 and again in 2015, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that any local regulations or bans on oil and gas development are invalid according to a statute. So basically that the Ohio government has passed a law saying that only the Ohio government shall regulate oil and gas production. So why did state legislators decide to centralize all authority over oil and gas development at the state level? And does the lack of local authority or the lack of home rule ensure that those who are most affected by hydraulic fracturing development are meaningfully included in decisions and policies regarding shale gas development? So I know Scott mentioned comment periods. Scott mentioned the permitting process. I'm wondering where local citizens are included in that process, and what your thoughts are on giving local communities the ability to regulate or control whether they want this form of development in their communities. So I'm not sure who might.
I mean, I'll start, and I think it's a good conversation, but it gets complicated because it's just not simply yes or no. In terms of, it depends on whether you're drilling on private property. It depends on whether or not you're drilling on township property. It depends on whether or not you're drilling on city property, state property, or it could be federal property. So, and that's a big difference right inside there. At a very, very local level, I live just outside of Columbus here in a small community called Pataskala. I graduated from Gahanna. I know a bunch of our city councils and our local township folks. Do I want them regulating oil and gas? No. They're not geologists. They're not engineers. They're not hydrologists. I feel more comfortable with those people that are experts regulating it. Now, that's on a personal level. That's first. on an industry level, I would say the same thing. I mean, one of the reasons why you need, unfortunately, to have a strong regulatory agency is we all know somebody, I don't care what business it is, that doesn't follow the rules. And if they don't follow the rules, there's got to be some penalty for them. There was a producer out of Youngstown, Ohio, and he was found in violation of violating the Clean Water Act. He's in jail. And myself, along with many others, applauded that decision. You can't break the rules, and that's why you do need to have maybe that good input on rules. You know, we got a little tiny community pool. The health department comes out and makes sure our chemical levels in the pool are correct. My local officials, I don't want to bother them with it. I want the health department to handle that. So in terms of regulations, and you know, when you are, whether it is setback rules or whether or not you should plug back at a certain place, I mean, the oil and gas industry, in terms of technology, it's only second to NASA. Okay, so you have to have really qualified people and hydrologists and geologists. Okay, very specialized engineers that understand the terminology and what's going on in order to regulate it.
Scott, if I could come to you, and if you wouldn't mind explaining the way that the local communities and the public are involved in are they involved in the permitting process, or just in making comments on rules, or what is?
Well, I think it's important to understand first is that the General Assembly gave us sole and exclusive authority in the permitting and siting of oil and gas wells. Now, we didn't petition them for that. They assigned that to us. They could change that tomorrow. If they decide that we're doing a reprehensible job in the administration of our law and regulations, and that local communities could do it better, they could reverse that decision and be an entirely, then we enforce the law. I'm a creature of statute. I do what the General Assembly, the elected officials in the General Assembly direct me to do, and I try to do it the best damn way I possibly can. We don't arrogantly flout that authority. That's a burden. That's a weight of responsibility, and we take that tremendously seriously. Believe me, we do. We didn't ask for it, but we're doing the best we can to implement it. I've said before that I view leasing as the ultimate local voice, but some of the other people that have shared that there are unitization and mandatory pooling processes that can pool people who did not voluntarily, who refused to sign leases. They can pool them into the drilling unit. So there are those exceptions. But leasing is an extremely important local voice. Most of our wells that are drilled in Ohio, the operator has a responsibility to test the quality of groundwater in specified radii around the area that they're going to develop. In many cases, that's the first water quality test that any of those residents have ever had. And what it does is it provides a baseline so that if subsequent to drilling and production we begin to notice changes in water quality, we have a basis and a knowledge of what it was before these processes occurred. And we can, in other words, it can expedite an investigation. We copied a law out of Pennsylvania on road use maintenance agreements. One of the things that their officials told us was shale development can place a heavy burden on local roads and bridges, and many of these bridges aren't rated to allow heavy oil field equipment to cross them. So we largely borrowed a law that had been developed on our eastern border, and before anyone can get a permit or can begin their operations and construction of the pad and the drilling of the wells, they have to work with the local jurisdictions who have the responsibility of maintaining those roads and come up with road improvement and maintenance agreements. I know early on when Chesapeake was developing up in Carroll County, in the first year of their development, the road supervisor, the county road supervisor up there told us that road improvement cost would be the equivalent of 50 years of his budget. Now, am I going to tell you that there aren't any road complaints? There probably are, but there's been a significant investment in the improvement of rural roads in eastern Ohio. Emergency response preparedness. We had an event early on in the play in Monroe County, I believe, where we had a significant fire during a fracking operation, and the response was poor from every angle, local, state, industry. It was a train wreck, and that's.
If you don't mind interrupting, I'd like to pull us to Greg, because I know, Greg, you also work trying to get local communities to have local control return to communities.
Right.
Well, look, if I could just finish that one remark, because out of that event, we created an emergency response program. And not only do they respond to reported incidents, but in the past year, we have participated in 169 training events with local emergency responders, county officials. We've participated in meetings where the industry calls a meeting of the local public to say we're going to begin development in these areas. We want to collect and be aware of your concerns. And so we've had this give and take with regards to equipping and training the local emergency responders, because they may have an important role down the road in responding to an incident. So those are just, in addition to the rules, in addition to some of our permitting processes require public comment periods. Those are some of the ways that we interact and get input from the public.
Thank you.
Yeah, from the standpoint of the residents of the state of Ohio, how they experience the regulatory system I think is probably a little different. I know the permitting process is 100% controlled by ODNR. The only appeal process that anybody in Ohio can have to any kind of an oil or gas well permit or an injection well permit, they don't have any. The only appeal process that exists in the state of Ohio is for mandatory pooling. And I actually went to the Oil and Gas Commission to watch one of those. The people I was talking about down in southeast Ohio who have had all the problems and have the compressor station, got 9 laterals on their property now. They held out. They didn't sign a lease for at least 3 years, and they finally gave in when they were going to be pooled. They were going to be unitized. They finally signed their lease when they were going to be unitized. Now they got 9 wells on their property, and it's a nightmare for them. They live in a nightmare. They don't want to move. They're probably going to end up moving eventually, but they live in a nightmare. Another one of those was. Actually, I saw this woman at the People's Permanent Tribunal. We had 2 tribunals this year on environmental justice and fracking in Ohio. And they're actually hoping, this is from the Center on Health and Environmental Justice, Lois Gibbs and some other people put this together. They're hoping to get this into the UN, into a UN committee, the testimonies that they had. I testified at one of them about Columbus. And I saw one woman who actually had to move out of her house because there's a compressor station about a half a mile away. She can't live inside of her house, never mind outside of her house anymore. So she had to move out of her house. She still owns it, so she had to leave her house and live with her parents. So you've got the regulatory process, but then you've got how people experience it. I went up and talked to some people.
Just so you know, compressor stations aren't under our authority, and we do not cite or permit those.
See, and that's another problem. Is that ODNR has 100% regulatory control over their permitting process, but the EPA is supposed to handle the air pollution and all these things, and so it just doesn't really get done. I know when we in Columbus 3 years ago, when we started our Columbus Community Bill of Rights, we started out as radioactive waste alert because we were focused on the new focus of the radioactive content of shale waste that really wasn't on everybody's radar, and now it started to get on people's radar. And gosh, I get lost in what I'm trying to say.
That's all right. So you've tried to have ballot issues
Well, yeah, what we're trying to do now is we want to get an ordinance on the Columbus ballot for what we call a Community Bill of Rights, which is basically a rights-based ordinance. 5 of them have passed in Ohio already. This is to based on our inalienable rights to pure water, clean air, safe soil, self-governance in our own community, unimpeded use of our own private property, all these inalienable rights we assume we have as Americans in our own community. And we're codifying it in our local code because we have no way to stop this from coming into our community. You know, if people sign leases and the rest of the community doesn't want it, or if somebody wants to dump in a landfill because the state of Ohio says they can dump in a landfill and we don't want it. We don't want it near our water. We don't want, the injection well control program. We don't see as a program that does a good job of keeping this waste under control. And so, we want communities to be able to say no, or to control it, to at least get into the courtroom. We don't even have a path into the courtroom as a resident in the state of Ohio, because unless somebody does something on our own personal property. If we live downstream from a compressor station and we get cancer, we get sick, we can't even get into the courtroom. We're not interested people. We're interested citizens to the courts. And so these Community Bill of Rights, the courts have to deal with our inalienable rights now and our community laws that we create. And so, we can sue. We can get into the court if we get harmed. There's a lot of harm going on that they don't talk about all over the country.
Kathy, I'd like to turn to you because I know that you've done research on ways that other communities have addressed governance issues. Do you mind sharing your perspectives on local community involvement in this forms of decision making?
Yeah, let me throw out a couple other things that echo what we're just talked about. The question of the fragmentation of the policymaking process is really important because different agencies have different jurisdictions, and they tend to have a narrow jurisdiction, which affects who has the ability to speak under those particular issues. It affects how do you know which one to speak to for which issue. It's a very complex environment. So, at least the Pennsylvania case is not only is there the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, but we also have 2 river basin commissions. And they have very different approaches to their regulatory system. Plus there's EPA. So there's this whole, very fragmented regulatory system. So where people can engage in that process is not always clear. It also means that what they regulate is delimited, and so they can't accept comments on anything that's outside of their particular jurisdictions. So risk that cuts across or that is the combination of issues doesn't have a particular home. So that kind of discussion, it's a very technical and narrow process of defining and assessing risk. So that's just a couple things. And this question about state preemption, PA is in the midst of figuring it out. We had several municipalities that did pass local restrictions that went up through the state Supreme Court. The Supreme Court invalidated parts of the law, but it's still being adjudicated as to which parts they can, that local community, what parts can local communities enforce and which ones can't. I'm not the lawyer understanding those issues, and if people want to ask, I can refer them, but just to know that that's still in process in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court cited is part of the Constitution is about environmental rights. So that is part of the conversation here is what does that mean? So just to throw that on the table as well. Aside from local bans, most of what has happened in Pennsylvania have been task forces of some kind or another. And these are generally county level, although not all, but they are county level and they are non-binding, non-authoritative, in that they are appointed usually by county commissioners, and they're advisory in capacity. So the task forces usually did a really good job of trying to get multiple voices at the table. They worked really hard at communication. They worked really hard at coordination to try to make sure that things like traffic and road issues were addressed. Where they had more trouble was dealing with some of the bigger issues around regulation, because they don't have authority to regulate, yet people were coming to them with those questions and concerns. So finding that right balance and right unit to do that. We had some that focused really heavily on education, so providing an opportunity for people to learn about the industry, to learn about the potential implications of the industry, which in the early years was really quite essential. And so, they filled that role. Many of those task forces have largely either disbanded or have scaled back their activities because of the downturn in the active drilling in most of the state. And we also found that most of those task forces were in the northern tier part of Pennsylvania, which had much less experience with oil and gas. The western part of the state that has a long history, what we heard is that they didn't see the need. They already knew it, they understood it, they knew how to take advantage of it. I think there might have been some missed opportunities there, but that's the main avenue we've seen here in Pennsylvania.
Chris?
One advantage that we've had here in Ohio is to witness what was going on in Pennsylvania. And I guess I'm kind of proud to say that from 2010 to 2015, my colleagues and I have talked to, just myself, I've talked to over 30,000 landowners here in eastern and southern Ohio to try to let them know about what was coming, what to expect, stuff from compression stations to the issues with pooling, the advantages and disadvantages of pooling. Pooling can be an advantage. If you're one that's wanting to lease ground, it's a disadvantage if you're one that's not wanting to lease ground. So I mean, there's huge issues on both sides of that. But we had the ability, OSU had the ability to be out in front of this with our clientele here in the state of Ohio. And like I said, I personally have talked to over 30,000 people about these very issues just to try to inform them so they could have an informed, so they could have an informed opinion on what to look for, what to ask, and what to be aware of.
What protection is there for landowners to ensure that that they have the full information to make an informed decision before they sign a lease? We
actually have on some of our web pages, like it's shalegas.osu.edu, isn't it, Ken? We actually have fact sheets and information to help inform landowners on a bunch of these issues. Ohio Department of Natural Resources also has a lot of information on that as well. So, the one thing that we've tried to do is go out and inform clientele. We've informed government officials. We've tried to educate them on what some of the issues are, the pros and the cons of it, because there are pros, there are cons with it.
If I could just elaborate that, because, we do a lot of landowner meetings, and while I'm an industry person, I'm also a landowner, and you can look at it from both perspectives. The landowner meetings that we do, being on both sides, is number one, we encourage this property rights issue. Typically, when we have a problem, it's because somebody owns the surface rights but doesn't own the mineral rights. I can't tell you how many times I've gone out and I've leased your property, for example, just using that hypothetically. I've now gone and spent 2 years, maybe millions of dollars on the research, looking at creating maps and 3D maps of what the geological formations look like underneath the ground. Because I sign a lease doesn't mean I'm going to drill a well. But I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend 2 years working on the science to decide whether or not I even want to drill a well. In the meantime, he sold his property. He kept the mineral rights. He sold it to you, or maybe Greg, he sold it to you. Now Greg, again, as a landowner, didn't know to ask about those mineral rights, didn't even know that the property was leased for oil and gas. I come back out on the property, I'm ready to drill my well because we decided in this case we like the geology. I go out there, I'll tell you what, Greg and I are not going to get along. And it's that disclosure. And I'm telling you, here in Ohio, we don't have too much of what's called a severed minerals issue. But I tell you what, in other parts of the country it is. And that really does create bad blood. He didn't tell Greg. Greg didn't know. Here I've come in. We think we've done everything. and we have done everything legally right, we are never going to get along, unfortunately. And that's really where you see that. So with landowners, we talk about making sure that you understand your mineral rights as well as your surface rights. And the other thing that we found out, and again, I've been around this industry for a long time, all of a sudden everybody and anybody was a qualified oil and gas attorney and knew mineral rights. Well, no, they didn't. And what they were also trying to do is say, forming these landowner groups and say, hey, we're not going to charge you a fee, but gee whiz, guess what? We're going to assess a little bit of your mineral rights. And actually what they did is they became a mineral owner. And so, and I think that's what's created some animosity even within landowners. So understand your mineral rights. Every landowner should know that. Every citizen in Ohio should know that. And number two, before you sign anything, I don't care if it's an oil and gas lease, 23 pages, or if it's something else that's 200 pages. Make sure you've got a qualified attorney and ask questions before you sign anything. We saw a lot of that, and it was really, it was really disturbing because, again, when we went out and drilled wells on property, that landowner is my partner. And they're going to be my partner for the next 20 to 40 years. I don't want to have a bad relationship with my landowner. I just don't.
You know, believe it or not, one of the biggest issues we saw over in eastern Ohio when the leasing started was peer pressure. When one landowner signed and everybody else felt the pressure to sign. And some of the leasing companies would even go to one landowner, actually find the most, for lack of better terms, the most vulnerable one, get them to sign, and then suddenly they'd all start falling like dominoes. And our biggest thing was warning people, make sure you go to an attorney, make sure you know what you're signing, because you don't want that compressor out there in your backyard.
No.
You don't want these other gas lines or other liquid lines going through your property. So, people get very, very nervous when they're approached with that. Someone saying you're going to become a millionaire, they get very nervous. And
It's not the Beverly Hillbillies.
It's
Ohio.
That was the biggest thing we were trying to face was, just hold off, take it to an attorney. And,
Yeah,
a lot
it's
of
the
them did, some of them didn't, so.
On the reverse side of that, also understand that we've had many incidents where we've had a compressor station or we've had an oil and gas well, and somebody's bought the property, and they turn around and build their house within 100 feet of the well, and then start screaming and yelling and taking pictures. Here's a compressor station, and here's a well. Why did you build a house right beside it? So we run into a lot of that too. And for me, on some of those are safety concerns for me as the operator of that well. And so, we see just the absolute reverse, but we're big on always making sure people know what they're signing. It's just huge.
So I think, because the landowner really does have the say, if they own the mineral rights, then that really does become a source of sort of, it falls on the landowner to make an informed decision whether
It
they want to.
starts with the
Starts with
landowner.
the landowner.
And they really need to go on the internet. I went to 4 of those meetings. I went to 2 landowner meetings. I went to 2 Farm Bureau meetings with Dale Arnold, who used to run the Farm Bureau meetings. Dr. Robert Chase, he runs the Marietta's engineering school, Marietta College. He was at 2 of these meetings, and they were telling people, they were explaining the chemicals that are in this stuff with people, and really downplaying it. He was comparing it with Dawn dish detergent, basically. That detergent you have on your thing and so forth, on your sink. That's a lot of this stuff is kind of like that. And there are some things that are worse than that, but that's how they talk about the chemicals at these landowner meetings. And I went to 4 of them. That's how they talk at every single one of those meetings. And Dr. Chase even went to go so far once as to say, and I brought up the movie Gasland. That's what got me going. Anybody here seen Gasland, the movie Gasland?
I'm in it.
You're in it, okay. It looks familiar.
Not favorably.
But, the industry hates that movie. It really hates that movie. They try to debunk it and everything. But
We have.
that got me going, and I brought that movie up at this landowner meeting, and Dr. Chase came later in the movie and says, you don't need to see that Gasland movie. That's how we put it to these people. So that's my impression of the information that they get at these landowner meetings. So you really have to get on the internet and do your own. You have to study. You have to do your own study to really understand what this industry is about. The downside of it. I mean, we're talking about the upside of it and the leasing, and you can make money, but they really don't get the downside of it until they have to see it for themselves, later on.
So I know that one issue is the mix of chemicals that are in the injection water. Do those chemicals themselves have pose environmental risks, or how are the environmental risks of the chemicals that are included in the fracturing water?
I assume you're asking me with that, and that's fine. I mean, yeah, we use chemicals during hydraulic fracturing. The three primary chemicals that we use, number one, we're going to use something, can't get into explanation, but we spend all this time making sure that our aquifers are protected. Well construction used to be hollowed out tree trunks. We still have some of those, more specifically sycamore trees, okay? We use multiple layers of steel pipe and cement. When we talk about putting that sand, this is frac sand here, okay? When we talk about putting that down under high pressure, if you know anything about sand, it can cut glass. So we are going to use a chemical, okay, that is going to help protect the integrity of the wellbore, okay? Multiple layers of steel pipe and cement, because you could never say that you're not going to have a casing failure. So we are going to use a chemical for that. So the next one we're going to use is something to kill bacteria. Look, I don't care where your water comes from. It could be Perrier, it could be here, it could be pond water. All water has bacteria in it. Just because it has bacteria in it doesn't mean that it's bad for you. I've been drinking this water here and I'm fine. But bacteria in the oil and gas business, when you take water under high pressure, you're actually introducing water into these virgin reservoirs. What bacteria likes to do just by nature is two things. One, bacteria likes to eat hydrocarbons. That's why they will add bacteria in the event of an oil spill. It's called bioremediation, to eat those hydrocarbons. Number two, bacteria by nature will also form clusters. And what they're going to do by forming those clusters is they're going to clog up these teeny tiny fissures that we just created in order for the oil and gas to flow through. So we are going to use something to kill bacteria. And the third most common is going to be more like a guar or a thickening agent. Guar is an agriculture product. That's why you do hear that comment about it's in puddings and gravies. It's a thickening agent. And it helps grab, I mean, we need it to help keep and hold those grains of sand inside those tiny fissures. So chemical disclosure, despite what everyone says, I hear it all the time, we have to disclose our chemicals. Chemicals must be disclosed. What doesn't have to be disclosed might be the recipe. So if I use an extra teaspoon of guar, that could be considered a trade secret. I teach a firefighter course. 2 weekends ago, you would have seen me in all full turnout gear. Our industry funds this. One of our entire lessons that we spend is on nothing but chemical disclosure. When they go up on location, they need to understand what placards are, how to identify them, how to know what chemicals could be on location. And every location may be a little bit different. But anyway, I mean, on the chemicals, yeah, we use chemicals. One of the primary chemicals we're going to use is natural gas before it comes into your home, into this building here. Okay, I don't know, what do you have, 20-some natural gas buses running through Ohio State's campus? We're going to add in a mercaptan. It's a chemical. Just because it's a chemical doesn't mean it's bad. But that mercaptan's added as an odorant. It's a safety component so you can smell it. You want that in there. So sometimes there's also this, it's a chemical, but all chemicals must be managed correctly.
Yeah, can I qualify on that a little bit? Senate Bill 315 that came out in 2013, I think, that was supposed to be this big, huge bill, to fix the fracking industry in Ohio and so forth. And that came out with that the industry does not have to reveal the chemicals that they put into a well or they treated a well with for 60 days until after they use them. 60 days until after they've used the well. 60 days. They could have it, injected, which ODNR doesn't even make them see, find out what's in the stuff that's injected all over the state either. But that's all these chemicals that we have. There's no requirement to immediately
Can I
make people
qualify
available.
that for you? I
Yep,
mean, just
go
to
ahead,
help
go
you
ahead.
out.
Yep.
Again, I'm talking about what we're training our firefighters for and stuff, because again, in the event of emergency. So chemical disclosure is there. When I'm in the middle of doing a hydraulic fracturing job, for example, that whole job, if it's a vertical well, it may take 2 hours, okay? Horizontal, it could take a couple days depending on how many stages I'm doing, okay? I can't report how many quantities of guar that I've used until I'm done with the whole job. So I'm not reporting it every day. The chemical disclosure is there if someone comes onto location, but it's impossible for me to create a report until I'm done. And that's why you don't see that report. We're not trying to keep anything secret from you. You got to give me a chance to put together the report, but I got to be done with that particular job in order to create the report. Frac focus is another great one. I mean, that lists chemicals constantly too. So, I mean, no one's trying to be anything secret. If there's an emergency on a well location, I want those emergency responders. I got workers out there. I want those emergency responders to be aware of what's going on at all times. No different than a hospital or a school. We all have to have our MSDS sheets. Everybody does. Kentucky Fried Chicken's got their MSDS sheet. We've got ours. Everybody has to disclose chemicals. I mean, you just do. But my report might not be ready that exact day because I'm in the middle still of that process.
My son is he's a paramedic in 3 fire departments in southeastern Ohio, Belmont County,
He's probably been to our training
Barnesville,
then.
St. Clairsville, and Bethesda. He's in all 3 of those
Has he been
departments.
to our training?
I'm sorry?
Has he been to our training?
I hope so. I don't know. I'll ask him.
find
I'll
out.
ask him.
Good.
But my point is, when they had the big fire, the train wreck you were talking about back in 2014, where 22 trucks burned on a well pad, it burned for 3 days. They came in, the first responders came in, they were pouring water on the fire. They didn't know it was there. They got 70,000 fish killed to that one. And then ODNR did not, the EPA did not get the chemical list for 5 days. ODNR had it for 2 of those days, and they did not get the list of chemicals that were in that fire. So nobody knew what they were fighting, what chemicals were there. 5 days when it counted. That's when it counted the most. That was
I'd
after
love to talk
Senate Bill
about that
215
incident because I'm
came
very
out.
familiar with it.
Yeah, I would.
I'm
I mean,
sure
I'd
you
love
are.
to spend an hour or two just talking on that incident.
But we
I
have
would qualify that. First, they may not have the quantity in pounds of how many and percentage of chemicals that are not required to be reported for those 60 days, but under OSHA law, you're required to have a material safety data sheet that explains the components of your chemical products, what hazards they present, and what personal protective equipment you ought to have if you're handling that material. Do you need nitrile gloves? Should you be wearing safety glasses? Do you need a respirator? All those things are listed for every product that's there because the companies are liable, their employees are working with those chemical substances. They have to be trained on how to handle them. And then in the event of an emergency response, those same documents have to be made immediately available to the responders. I described that event as a train wreck. One of the things that happened, the company was in compliance with OSHA. They had their material safety data sheets on location. Guess what? The trailer where they were located was part of what was consumed in the fire. It took the company a couple of hours to send copies from their local office to the site when responders, so that was one of the things, that was a lesson learned. From that point forward, every single pad where horizontal well drilling is occurring, they typically have a security guard shack out by the road that is not up on the pad where the activity is. They keep duplicate copies there. We're not going to get stuck in a situation where people are scrambling to figure out how to safely respond to an emergency release.
It's a mustard point.
Yep, there's a
usually.
muster point. So there's a lot of interesting things. Now, last year, we track every incident, chemical spill on pads. And we've got new, amongst the most nation's stringent regulations. The most serious event and release that we had last year that we responded to was a 300-gallon hydrochloric acid spill. It was contained within secondary containment and within a few hours restored to primary, all cleaned up. That was about the most serious that we had. We've learned quite a bit from that initial. We have created an emergency response team. They're out on the road. They're working with the local community responders. Rhonda's group does a lot of education, and I think we've learned some valuable lessons from that initial serious incident.
Our firefighter training program, we're the first in the country to do it. We don't have to fund it as an industry. I mean, and I don't mean that arrogantly, we don't, but we have. We've trained fire departments from 49 counties here in Ohio. That's how many counties produce oil and gas. We've had fire departments from 7 other states. You hear a lot about North Dakota. Their training facility looks up as ours. Why do we fund it? It's our responsibility to make sure our local firefighters are trained. 70% of the firefighters in the state of Ohio are volunteers. It is our responsibility, and it's other industries' responsibilities to make sure that we have good training.
Great. So we have about 25 minutes left, so I'd like to open the floor to questions. Why don't we start? You, sir, in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, when did they start requiring all grants? When did they start requiring all grants? I know Halliburton fought that tooth and nail, about disclosing chemical review. Is that been recent that they require it now, state?
It's very early in the play. Well, first of all, in 2010, before Frac Focus, which is a chemical registry, was created by the Groundwater Protection Council, there wasn't a convenient way to report all that information. Mike Shelton and I worked on a law that was the first chemical disclosure law for hydraulic fracturing chemicals in the entire country. What it required companies to do was submit their job invoices, so we could see a list of all the chemical products that were used, and they got to deduct the prices. So that was 2010, but then Frac Focus, that law came into effect, I believe, in 2012. And you ought to visit Frac Focus at just fracfocus.org. You'll see there's a lot of chemical information. But I still say that what's valuable to the local responder is the material safety data sheet. My father was an organic chemist, and one day he came home and he told a joke at the dinner table, which was, did you hear about the chemist that fell into the esterification kettle? And the punchline was, he survived, but he was severely mutilated. And it's not funny, because we're not organic chemists. We have no idea what these, and so the notion that if you knew how much percent of this chemical and this chemical and that chemical were in a mix, you'd be safe, most people would have a clue what to do with it. That's why the material safety data sheet that guides you through what you need to protect yourself is the critical component. That's been a long-standing OSHA regulation.
Yeah, I don't even know how long that chemical disclosure and that OSHA regulations that we've had to comply with for a long time.
Yep.
What Scott's saying is this was in addition to that.
No-
Corey, Steve gave me the microphone.
Oh, good. Then you're next.
Probably because I'm his boss.
Yeah.
So I have 2 questions for the panel. One is this. I was pleased to hear that the chemicals that are used have to be reported, and as I understand it, you said that the risks have to be reported as well. The risks have to be listed. I'm wondering who is responsible for doing the testing on these chemicals to determine what the risks are, and how confident are we that that testing is being done well and thoroughly? Is this a governmental responsibility? Is it an industry responsibility, et cetera? So that's my first question. The second one is, we've talked only about the chemicals that are present in the mix that's used for the actual fracking. And the wastewater, of course, contains many other things, including radioactive chemicals and lead and so forth. And there have been spills of these of the wastewater. So I'm wondering whose responsibility it is to test what is in the wastewater and to determine whether it's being disposed of safely and to remediate any damage that's done.
No, it's going to start with a leak. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to that, what you just asked. So the chemicals that we might use in anything, obviously you got an entire chemical industry out there, and pharmaceutical industry. You've got, I mean, not just petrochemicals. So obviously we're going to want things tested. I'm not an expert, I'm not a chemist on what the levels are, but ultimately, if I sign a lease with you, I'm going to want to make sure that anything that I do in my operations, because ultimately in my lease agreement with you, I am responsible. I am responsible. If something happens to your water, I am responsible for that water. So obviously, there's a lot of testing. I can't be specific. I'm just not, it's way above my pay grade. I've never been involved in the testing of certain chemicals. So I'm not sure exactly who does that official testing. I just know that before I'm buying anything, you know, we're going to want to make sure that it meets some kind of standards. It's just not my area of expertise.
Scott, do you have?
You bring up the point of produced water, that aside from the chemical additives that are used in hydraulic fracturing, produced water can range in Ohio anywhere from 30,000 parts per million chloride up to 300,000 parts per million chloride. We're talking about something that is twice to 10 times as saline as seawater, or even more. If it had no chemical additives, you do not want that on soil. You don't want it in your streams, and I don't want it in groundwater. And that's what I've spent a career working to protect those environments from. It used to be when I was first employed, every oil and gas well had a pit next to it, and the produced water was just put in that, leached out. If there was a down gradient water well or domestic spring, I cut my teeth on one day. The chief was walking down the hall and she said, "We need to create a program to respond to citizen complaints about all the contamination that we're hearing about." She assigned that to me. And systematically, as we identified ways of managing produced water that were non-protective and inadequate, we got rid of them by statute. In 1985, we banned surface pits in Ohio, banned them. And we went out and inspected every dang one of them to make sure that they were closed. There aren't any more. We forced the industry towards more protective methods of waste management, and we've seen a remarkable change.
But your question was, are they actually testing that fluid as it comes out of the ground? I haven't seen much of that testing.
Is anyone here from Ohio Geological Survey? I don't think I recognize anybody. We've done a lot of, we've had Geological Survey do a number of research projects for us to characterize the inorganic composition of oil-filled brines. They've got about 500 produced water, pretty detailed analyses. We also have implemented a program when our inspectors are out in the field at random as trucks are coming into injection wells. We collect samples just to keep them honest, and we run a very detailed analysis on those samples just to evaluate, is someone trying to sneak something in here other than produced water? And don't get me wrong, you've heard my position. I don't take produced water lightly. I don't want it in the environment. I want it deep injected, or I want it managed in another way that is safe and keeps it from damaging the environment.
I was going to ask you, what's worse than produced water?
But we're also looking at ways, this is produced water right here, that's why I brought a couple of this. We're also, like everybody else, this industry's come a long way since 1860s, where, you know, those gushers, you know, oil squirting out all over the place, that was acceptable. That'd be a major environmental disaster and fines today. But we're also looking at ways that, in terms of testing, and again, I'm not a chemist, where this is just a brine, and they are able now to take this and obviously process it. There's a company called Aqua Salina here in Ohio. It's just been approved by the Snow Fighters Association because it actually has lower sodium chlorides Scott, you probably understand this much better than I do, than rock salt in water. They're also figuring out ways that we can dehydrate this produced water. Remember, we were covered by ocean. We could not change that. So a lot of this salt water that's coming up out of the ground, instead of re-injecting it, why can't we figure out ways to recycle and reuse it? This here, they've just dehydrated it. This is just, think about it, ancient sea salt, okay? And this is in the process being tested. So there's a lot of new ways in testing. The other water, we're going to test water before we drill. We're also going to be testing it afterwards. We're also going to be testing landowners' water months down the road, maybe years down the road. I will tell you formally, I don't work for an oil and gas producer anymore. I can't tell you how many times we informed landowners that they've got some major problems in their water. Okay? A lot. That happened a lot.
I'd like to move us forward to get a few more questions. We have someone over here.
I have a question. We've got a lot of young students here. And I'm curious, it seems like there are 3 people here that are pro-fracking and 1 person that is not for fracking. It doesn't seem like a very balanced. I'm not sure about the woman. I haven't heard much from her on video. But I feel like the students haven't really heard a very balanced picture. I'm obviously not for fracking. I'm very concerned about our water because these chemicals they're talking about are carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, which mess with your reproductive hormones, and neurotoxins. And if they get into our water supply, especially the radionuclides, those are slow-moving, bone-seeking carcinogens, leukemia, breast cancer, bone cancer. So this stuff, the way they're talking, oh, it can be regulated. Well, I heard Craig Butler of the Ohio EPA say there are all these inadvertent exits from this frack stuff because of all the former wells. And it comes out. It comes out of the earth. It gets into our water. We don't really know where it's going when it goes into these injection wells. So I would like to have more balance for these young students because this chemicals, and what about the methane? What about all this methane and climate change? Aren't we concerned about this? And why aren't we creating new jobs, training people for truly clean energy? And you know what?
Let's hear from some of the students then.
Let's hear from the students and not just industry.
I'd like to qualify. I'm not here as a hydraulic fracturing advocate. I'm here as a regulator.
For the
because-
ODNR.
Because I'm charged by the General Assembly with allowing hydraulic fracturing to occur while trying to make sure that it is done in a way that is protective of drinking water.
And I don't think you're pro.
May I mention one incident that we're talking about testing it and so forth? That injection well materials, like you said, I guess they do spot checks or something, but I don't think it mostly gets done. We've had one major accident with a brine spill with a truck that rolled over in Barnesville. It closed down one of 3 of Barnesville's drinking water reservoirs for more than 2 months last year. My son was the first responder that got there to the truck, so that's why one of the reasons I was concerned. But it closed out a reservoir for 2 months. And this was, it was explained to me in a really good way. This was in March when the water levels were high in the reservoir. This truck overturned on a turn right, and this was in the source water protection area for this reservoir, for this area. And that's what we're concerned about in Columbus because these injection wells are in our source water protection area. And the oil and gas industry is the only industry that I know of, period, that is exempt from not being able to transport these exact same types of chemicals and materials and everything in source water protection areas for people's drinking water. And so this truck rolled in Barnesville, closed a water source down for 2 months till they finally determined that it was safe. This was in March when there was a 63,000 to 1 dilution ratio in the reservoir. And if it was in July or August, I don't know if that's one of the reservoirs, frackers are sucking water out of at least one of their reservoirs down there, their water sources down there. It could have been much worse. And even the radionuclide, the radium levels spiked. They measured a spike in the radium levels. So this is the concerns we have.
Chuck, is that true?
Yeah, there was a registered spike in the radium levels in the EPA testing. I don't think they measured above 5 picocuries, but that they measured a spike in the radium levels.
At the point of the spill or at the drinking water?
I think,
I'm Chuck Cracken. I'm also with the Department of Natural Resources. I'm the Remediation Safety Program Manager there. I already have to start a program. The problem with that statement is you're not qualifying them with any real spike in radium content. What is that? You said with 5 picocuries per,
is that a what?
you said 5 picocuries per liter?
It didn't, the testing results did not exceed the limit, 5 picocuries per liter. But it was a registered spike, just from this spill, went into a creek, and then it was almost 5,000 gallons out of the truck, and most of it ended up in the reservoir. And so they did part of the testing that they,
Water standards, 5 picocuries per liter. That's legally allowed to drink that by EPA standards. 5 picocuries per liter is the US EPA drinking water standard.
right. I'm pointing out that 5,000 gallons going into this huge reservoir was enough to register a spike when there was a lot of water in the reservoir. That's what I'm pointing out. That's the stuff that goes on and happens with the regulatory system that allows these things to occur in the state, because they're exempt. The oil and gas industry is exempt from so many things, which this is one of them, that they could drive their trucks with all this stuff around our drinking water and get a spill like that. That's bound to happen, and it happens. So.
All right,
The,
so I know we had a couple of more hands, so let's,
I'm a student.
hi.
Hi. I'm a graduate student in the philosophy program. So I'm particularly interested in justice. That's what I research, but I'm not so familiar with environmental justice, at least not to the degree that Corey is. So I want to bring us back to that a little bit. And we've been talking about the costs and benefits of this shale gas development, but I'm particularly concerned that although we might think there are benefits, the costs compared to other renewable energy resources are so exceptionally high. And when we think about property, it seems like as an issue of justice, we just ought to be going in for these other renewable sources because they don't introduce these same severe costs, and they don't introduce the same issues when it comes to property ownership. We don't worry about peer pressuring when someone wants to install solar panels on their home compared to the person next door who's not interested or something like that. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about why you think costs and benefits weighed against these other types of renewable energy resources. We should still be going in for this, especially when we're concerned with environmental justice.
Which
There is some-
renewables are you specifically speaking about?
Solar and wind, I think.
Okay.
I think there are some peer pressure issues with wind. I've read a lot of issues with some of the wind power. But let me just, something that really transformed me in the past year was to change the direction we're going right now. Back in the 40s, a third of my county was sold for coal mining. A whole third was sold, and a whole third of our county was taken away for coal mining. And then as some of this natural gas production has come on, all of our coal plants over in my area have shut down and gone to natural gas, which tends to have a smaller footprint. But what really transformed me a little bit was last year in 2016, renewable energy went over 10% of our energy production here in the state. And the ability, and I'm thinking of this as a transitional period. I see more natural gas production now and a lot less coal production going on. But with the natural gas production going on, it has allowed more renewable energy to come on because of the ability of some of these less expensive, more nimble, newer type plants were able to turn on and off faster. So now that the sun's going down and the wind's not blowing, we may switch over to more natural gas and less renewable. Now I see the period coming on and the technology is coming on where we're going to be able to capture more of that and store it in some type of battery charging or something like that. So I see, and it's really changed my thought process, I see it changing. Maybe not as fast as a lot of us would like to see, but I see a lot more. I see us now moving into a transition period.
So it's
I'm seeing, yeah, with one of the side benefits of more natural gas production versus coal. Well, one is my whole, a third of my county's not going out. So from the small perspective, I'm seeing that. But from the larger perspective, this natural gas is allowing more of a transitional period to go on versus coal, because of what it takes a day or so for a coal plant to fire up and then fire down. There has to be a certain amount of electricity on the grid at all times. So now, now that the sun's going down, the wind's not blowing, we can kick up more some of the natural gas production because it's a lot faster. So I'm seeing some of this as really helping along some of the renewable energy.
25% of our electricity use today is just for computers. That's it. We're not using fewer computers. And then most people have an iPad and an iPod and a PlayStation. I'm probably dating myself on a couple of these electronics, but yeah, I mean, energy doesn't come from two little holes in the wall. And you'd be amazed how difficult that is to explain to some people. Just like chocolate milk doesn't come from a brown cow. And I'm not saying that lightly. We need all energy sources. We do. There's not one energy source that can do it all. This forum here just happened to be on shale production, but we need them all. I've often heard the renewable energies called alternative energies. I don't like that term only because they're not necessarily replacing a fuel. We're using 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy each year. And in less than 2 decades, we're going to be at 130 quadrillion because we're using a lot more electricity. So we need all forms of energy, and all forms of energy, we have to develop them responsible. One energy source can't do it all.
I logged on to the Energy Information Agency website before I came here, and I was tickled to see that in their annual report for 2017, the dramatic increase
It's huge.
in the percentage of our electrical supply that is derived from renewables. I like renewables, but keep in mind that the products that you need to make renewables, whether it be geothermal, whether it be solar or wind, come from mines. Now, I spent 10 years over the agency that permits and regulates mining, and as ardent as the opposition to oil and gas development is to some people, it's equally they're equally vociferous in opposing the development of mines within their areas as well. So if you're going to advocate for those, you're going to have to advocate for the extraction of those mineral resources from the earth, and that's just part and parcel with advocating those alternative energy sources.
Well, they're coming up with a lot of new technologies too. A lot of using carbon instead of exotic minerals for a lot of things too. So we've got to keep that in mind.
Great. Next question, please.
I've got the microphone.
You have the microphone.
I'm Kathy. I have a question also going back to perhaps justice, environmental justice, and social justice, and perhaps directed to Kathy first, maybe Christopher. Extraction of natural resources takes value out of the ground and distributes it somewhere. And I'm wondering if there are people looking at the burden to a local community versus the benefits to a local community, and who gets the benefits of that extraction. Because sometimes it seems to me like the benefits are all going outside of the local community. And even if a local landowner benefits from selling rights, often that person is no longer on the land, has taken that wealth and gone to some other community. So I'm wondering if somebody's looking at long-term benefits or burdens to local community and how the environmental benefits burdens might factor into that as well. It's complicated, I know, but
Kathy, were you able to hear the question?
Most of it. If I understood it, it was how much is being kept local in terms of the economic benefits, and how does that weigh against environmental costs?
Yeah, sort of distributive justice question. Are the local communities bearing most of the cost, but then the wealth is going mostly going elsewhere outside of the local communities?
It's a great question. I don't know that we really know the answer fully. The primary way that people can benefit economically is through the leasing, so it's driven entirely by the ownership of the subsurface rights. So if it's in a place where local people own those subsurface rights, more of that money can be captured locally. And if you have economic sectors locally, so enough businesses that can ramp up and capture those dollars locally, then more of those dollars can stay there. What we have seen, probably one of the questions that is in a lot of people's minds is coal has a history of being extra locally owned. And is that the case with this industry as well? Again, it depends on which part of the dollar you're talking about, but the landowner, if they own their subsurface rights, they can keep it local. The industry itself is a multinational set of companies. There are companies that are very regional. They were founded and they exist in the Appalachian Basin. There are companies that are multinational and have holdings all over the world. The mix of that varies across plays, and it varies across time. In the early stages of the Marcellus, there were many companies, over, I can't remember the exact number, 60, 70 companies, more of them local. And as that became a proven resource, more of the big players came in and had a stake in it. So it changes over time as well. And in terms of comparing that to the environmental issues, they're not really commensurate. So in terms of who bears it, what we know is that environmental issues, where they exist, tend to be quite local. They tend to be in drinking water. They tend to be around spills or around accidents and fires. So they tend to be quite local and near the development activity. But it ranges out to, somebody mentioned earlier, methane migration, methane loss, which is a global issue. So exactly who bears those costs, I don't know. Depends on which one you're talking about. They don't match up neatly in time or in space.
So I think we're at 5, but we'll have time for one more question.
So my question is, I don't know a lot about fracking, but from what I understand, when the water goes in, makes these fissures, things come out. Do we put anything back in to keep that land stable? And then whether we do or not is going to lead to the next question of fracking happening in the West and earthquakes that are not on fault lines or anything like that are happening on really old rock. I think one of you up here are geologists, and I don't remember, or at least know some geology. But with the geology of Ohio and the surrounding rock, like you stated, it's fantastic because it's old. But that also is one of the biggest issues. Old rock reverberates motion a lot further and longer than in fault lines and things like that. So my question for environmental justice, on top of, one, if we put anything back to keep or restabilize the land, is if the land is not stable, because 15 hours ago, Oklahoma has experienced another earthquake. I think it's like 2 point something. And I want to know, as a future Ohioan who's going to be living here for probably the rest of my life, because I've already spent 25 years here, what kinds of things or policies are we putting in place to take on those repercussions 25, 30, 40 years from now, or even a few months from now when earthquakes and stuff are happening, and even the aesthetic value of what I love about Hocking Hills or what I love about Wayne National Forest is gone.
Well, you won't lose those. But there's a lot there that you've given me to digest. We had a injection well up in Mahoning County, the North Star well. In 30 years of running our injection program, there had never been a felt or measured earthquake attributable to injection. I'm not talking hydraulic fracturing, I'm talking injection of those wastewaters. All of a sudden, we had our first. We created what is generally regarded as the nation and perhaps the world's best seismic monitoring program to evaluate induced injection or induced seismicity that could be related to either hydraulic fracturing or wastewater injection activities. We have substantially increased the number of seismometers that are stationed around the state. We passed the country's first regulations that address induced seismicity, and these seismic stations are they send signal. We have people 24/7 that are monitoring every seismic event that exceeds certain magnitudes, and believe me, those magnitudes are very, very low, way below ones that you would ever feel. But we're keeping track of those. In my email in basket every single day, I open up multiple emails alerting me that there's been a measured seismic event somewhere in Ohio. Nearly all of them are mine blast, lightning strikes, noise, teleseismic events from earthquakes that occur in Chile and other places. But every once in a blue moon, we get one that prompts us to do an investigation. Oh, by the way, when Curtis Samuel scores an overtime victory over that team up north, that was a 5.1. That 5.1. That's much larger than any detection we've ever had for injection. In the past 4 years, 14 through 17, since we've installed these seismic, we've had 5 completion operations where they're running hydraulic fracturing, where we've identified seismic events that were above 2.5. Now, all of them were unfelt and none of them resulted in any damage. But by our policy, anytime there is something that reaches that level, we're in immediate communication with the operator and they shut down. And we work out modifications in their plan that would enable, if we can, reach agreement on a modified, they skip stages, they reduce pressures, reduce volumes, stop zipper fracs. I won't go into that. We have a variety of strategies that we make them address because we don't want to see felt property damaging earthquakes. At injection wells, we have had 2 injection wells out of our 30 plus years of operating that program. One of them was that North Star. That was our very first one. Generated a 4.0. We shut them down. That well's been plugged. And then we've had one other that generated an unfelt event. We shut them down. They have maintained in that shutdown status, and we're being sued for a regulatory taking because we have prevented them.
That's the one at Niles.
Yep.
Was it a 5.1? Was it?
Or they're just now these fissures in
Yeah.
the ground.
Yeah.
Those fissures, Rhonda mentioned, they're filled with sand. Once you release that pressure, other than that, they come back. If that sand wasn't there, there wouldn't even be enough of an opening after the frac job for the methane to release. So in other words, there are not many seismic events in Ohio. The ones that we've have been largely unfelt and undamaging.
All right, so you can come up and continue the conversation, but let's stop here and thank our panelists and thank you all for.
I'd like to thank you. I thought, how many students are going to show up from 3 to 5 on a Friday afternoon?
Yeah,
I'm
I
impressed
That's
with
pretty
you.
good.
Yeah.